All right, next up we've got a question that's basically about Trac. So I wanted to pull up the Trac report in question here. The question is essentially, how is it possible to have a short-term fatigue that's much higher than expected, but a long-term fatigue that's too low? Wouldn't consistently high short-term fatigue lead to high long-term fatigue? And yeah, so that's generally the gist of this question. So I wanted to explain a little bit about where some of these numbers come from and how you can make sense of this. So the short-term fatigue, actually we can drill down into that. So let's look at this person's short-term fatigue a little bit closer. So this is his short-term fatigue graph. So we can see that what this green line represents is their trend line. All the blue dots are data points, and the red dot is today's data point. So what this tells us is this green line is the average of what happens. We have short-term volume load on the bottom here and short-term fatigue load on the top. So short-term in the context of Trac is 4 days. So what that tells us is this is a pretty flat green line. So that tells me that for this lifter, the change in volume doesn't really matter a whole lot. As we look at differences in volume over a 4-day period, the average fatigue that this lifter is experiencing is pretty consistent. It seems to always be around a 2.5 or a 3. Obviously there's variance there, and that's what these gray lines represent. They represent the one standard deviation above and below the line. And you can find all that stuff out by clicking on this question mark and reading up on that stuff. So what this tells us, this red line you can see is it's right on the one standard deviation gray line. Okay, so that's where the indication comes from that the fatigue is higher than expected. So this green line is what we expect. So if you're between the green and the gray, then that's a little bit higher than expected. If you're above the gray line, then you're a lot higher than expected. So that's where the short-term fatigue comes from. The long-term fatigue is a bit more simple. So let's look at your long-term fatigue graph. So this one is a bit more static. So instead of it being a trend line and kind of a regression and everything, it's just your 30-day average fatigue level. And we say that if your 30-day average is below a 3, then it's too low, which is really too low is depends on the context of how you're improving in your training. If you're still improving in your training, then it's fine. But we call below 3 too low. And then if you're between 3 and a 4.5, then you're just right. Then the yellow will be slightly high, and then the red obviously is too high. So that's how it's possible that you can consistently have short-term fatigue that's higher than expected, yet your long-term fatigue can still be too low. It's because the short-term fatigue is based on what's normal for you, and the long-term fatigue is not. It's more of a static recommendation. So both of those are kind of already baked in. So if we kind of go back and look at your action items, like that's all already considered when we get to this part about training recommendations. So hopefully that helps. If you have any more questions on that, please let me know.